guys, welcome back to another video, and in this video we're going to be continuing on with our macOS development with AppKit tutorial series, and in this particular video we're going to be taking a look at how we can create a horizontally, not horizontally, a vertically oriented slider. In the previous video, we took a look at how we create horizontally oriented sliders. I was getting a bit ahead of myself there, but yeah. So I mentioned in that video that we can make vertical sliders, and that's what we're going to take a look at in this video. So what I have to start us off with is in Xcode. If we go to Xcode here, and we go up to the top of our file here, inside of our view controller, I have a slider called HSlider for horizontal slider, and this version of the initializer is taking in a value. So what value is it currently? In this case, it's 0.75. So it's about 3/4 of the way to the end of the slider. Then we have a minimum value of 0 and a maximum value of 1. And we have a target, which we're setting to nil. And then we have an action, which we're giving a selector pointing to a value changed method. And all this is doing, all that method is going to do is it's going to print the current value of the slider to the console. That's all it's doing. Nothing too complicated. All right. So I also have the background of our view set to black. So it's a little bit darker of a background instead of the normal dark mode background, using the layer property that we talked about before and the once layer Boolean property. All right. Then I have a configure UI method that is going to be used to configure our UI elements. And then inside of that configure UI method, I also am calling another method called configure constraints, which is just going to configure the constraints for our user interface components. Pretty simple setup. It's nothing too complicated, nothing that you can't figure out. I'm confident you can do it, because we have been, of course, configuring constraints from the beginning. So it's kind of a skill that I think we've bashed you over the head enough with that you should start to understand it. If you don't, that's fine. Ask questions in the comments. I'm always willing to answer them. Whenever there's a question, I always strive to answer them as soon as I possibly can to aid in your learning, so you're not sitting there baffled, sitting there waiting for a response. But if I don't get to it, like I've said before, read the documentation. Go to something like Stack Overflow or r/Swift on Reddit, that kind of stuff. People over there are also more than happy to help you. But one thing you should keep in mind, though, is that on Reddit, they will try to urge you to do SwiftUI. And if you're dead set on AppKit, your best bet is to specify that you want to learn AppKit, so you kind of have an idea of how all that stuff works. Because it's good to have knowledge of how to use AppKit alongside SwiftUI if you're building macOS apps. All right. So with that out of the way, let's get started. First thing I want you to do is I want you to create a new slider. So I'm going to go ahead and copy this slider here. We're going to copy that and paste. And instead of calling it HSlider, we're going to call it VSlider, like that. So this is going to be our vertical slider. Now, I already have the constraints for our vertical slider configured. If we go down to that method, so we can see that our HSlider, our horizontal slider, it goes along the top of our view. it's 50 units below the top of our view, and then it extends to 50 units away from the leading and trailing edges to kind of give it that much padding. And then the vertical slider is going to be oriented in the center of the view horizontally and expand to be 50 units below the bottom anchor of our horizontal slider and 50 units above the bottom anchor of our view. So they're kind of oriented in a T shape, but I'm doing that to kind of show you what each slider looks like, so you kind of have a better idea, right? So let's go ahead and go into Configure UI. And then I'm going to copy paste the configuration code for our horizontal slider, and we're going to change a couple things. All right. All right, and we'll copy that and paste that. Change H slider to V slider. All right, so instead of H, it'll be V. And then inside of here, again, it'll be V slider. All right, so now our vertical slider has the same configuration as our horizontal slider, except we need to change one property. And that's all we need to really change here. And that is our, so what that is it is our isVertical property. So I'm going to go up there. Now, instead of false, we're going to change this to true. Now, by changing that to true, that tells AppKit, hey, this slider is supposed to be oriented vertically, not horizontally. And so with that, we should be able to run our code, but I'm going to go down to the value changed method here real quick. And we don't want to print just the value for the horizontal slider. We also want to print the V slider dot double value like that. There we go. Now, let's run our code. And here we are in our application. We can see here that we have our horizontal and our vertical sliders. I want to make sure that, yeah, everything should be fine. Right? All right, so let's see where I want to make sure that the vertical slider is actually on screen here. So it looks like it is, but it's not centered in the window for whatever reason. So let's take a look at the constraints here just to be sure. Okay, so we have, yep. The top anchor is on the is attached to the bottom anchor of the H slider, so that's fine. Okay, it's attached to the bottom anchor. I set the center Y anchor instead of the center X anchor. This is the perfect example of how you can mess up your constraints super easily if you're not paying attention. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to change this from center Y anchor to center X anchor. So center Y, change that to X. There we go. Now let's run it. Okay. And there we go. Now it's in the center of the window. This is what we wanted it to look like. And you can kind of see now how it looks like, how it's kind of in a T shape. There's our horizontal slider. And there's our vertical slider. Now let's kind of talk a little bit briefly about why you might want a vertical slider in your app. Well, if you are, for example, making an application where you're processing audio, like let's say a Logic, GarageBand, some kind of music production app, right? A vertical slider might be helpful if you want to simulate a switchboard, like a recording studio switchboard. Because those often have sliders that you can adjust up and down to adjust certain values. So that in and of itself is a really useful tool, right, to have in your tool belt. And that's kind of why those exist, really. And they've been around since the very first version of macOS 10, way back when it was introduced in 2000. So that was a long, long time ago. But that pretty much does it for this video, guys, on how we can create a vertical slider in AppKit. Thank you all so very much for watching, and we'll see you in the next one.